they were concerned with diversity comics for everyone. Even though they were a black-owned company, they were already concerned with people who were LGBTQ, right? They were concerned with people who were poor. They were concerned with people who were white, Cuban, whatever. They were already doing the work, right? And these were good books. And when I was in the 90s, I was kind of disenchanted with like all the different crossovers and all the stuff the X-Men was doing. This excited me, and I wanted to be down with them, right? So Mark Derry is actually juxtaposing Black comics already with this idea of Afrofuturism. So for some reason, though, we've kind of lost sight of that. This is my third talk in a 3-day venture here from California. I had the extreme pleasure to speak to my colleague Joel Christian Gill's students earlier today at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. Wonderful, wonderful students there. And then yesterday I spoke at the Center for Cartoon Studies in Vermont. So it's been a very, it's been real busy, man. One thing I want to do, I definitely want to thank Lamertje Frazier and Autumn Cole for bringing me out. And we worked really hard on putting this together, so thank you so much. Can we get another round of applause for them? I also want to thank my friend Stacey Robinson, who's been very supportive. He's the co-founder of Black Kirby, which is our studio. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. I also want to give a shout out to Damian Duffy. I mean, it's very difficult. Comics can be very collaborative. You know, you can actually be a single auteur and make a comic yourself. But in this particular case, Damian Duffy, who I've been working with for 15 years, is the co-author of the Kindred piece. I want to make sure that he gets his due because it's very difficult to deal with that particular legacy. I mean, you think Beyonce fans are rabid. Octavia Butler fans, oh my goodness. I'm like, look. I'll talk about that a little bit more too. But yeah, he's a wonderful writer. And I want to say also a follow-up piece, we actually have a 2-book deal to do Parable to Soar and Parable to Talents we're working on right now. I'm gonna take my time because I'm like, I'm so full of things right now. Okay, I'm like, whoa, okay. All right, so the title of my talk is Sequential Sankofa, Critical Nostalgia, Afrofuturism and the Black Comix Archive. First of all, I'm gonna do a geek reading, a nerd reading of the room. Like, how many people read comic books? Okay, all right, pretty good. Okay, all right, okay, that's good. That's way better than I thought, actually. And how many people are really familiar with the history of like Black independent comic books, though? Somewhat. Okay, because there is a really, really powerful, like all the Black comic book artists is like, yeah, because that's the thing. And so this particular talk I've done, this is the 3rd time I've done a version of this talk. The first 2 times though, one of them I did at this International Graphic Novel Conference in England. And it was about nostalgia, like the idea of, it was called retro. So looking at this notion of like the archive and the idea of the retro. And so what I did is I told them a story, right? And what I did was I told them, like, you know, an Afro-American story can also be known as a lie, right? It's like, you tell a story, right? So what I did is I actually created a fiction about some of the things I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to do that to y'all, though, you know. What I wanted to do is present the idea of a dream deferred through this particular company called All Negro Comics. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But what I did is I pretended that they were not destroyed by racism, that they actually were able to continue to publish the books that they could have published, right? Because we're talking about speculations of spaces that could have been. And when I took that rug out from under them, they were like, what? You know? They were like, why did this happen? I was like, yeah, because why would you want to empower someone you know, through the image, right? Because a lot of the things around our bodies are about the images, right? So I'm going to show you a few things that I've been working on, and then I'm going to talk about really kind of a show and tell, just kind of talk about some of the people that I think are like really seminal folk in the movement right now, and also talk about some of the things I'm working on in cultivating what I call sequential Sankofa, or Sankoferation. We're going to come back to that. and a couple other announcements, and we're going to talk about a few other things. The other thing I also want to do is I want to shout out my big brother, Jabari Asim, whose new book is out right now. It's called We Can't Breathe. And one of the things I want to talk about as well is like how like independent publishing and also the usage of narrative as a liberation technology. How we've always fought back during these ideas of using the story, right? Through education, right? As Frederick Douglass stated, education makes a man unfit to be a slave, right? Which is one of my favorite quotes by him. James Baldwin said that artists are here to disturb the peace. So I'm hoping that I disturb you properly, you know? So, all right. So here's just the body of my work. I'm going to talk over some images. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures. It'll be like this, okay? I've been working in this area called, I guess, Afrofuturism for the last decade, but I've been doing a lot of independent publishing for like 15 years or so. Originally, I'm from Mississippi, born in 1970, post-segregation era. And I grew up in a very rural space with a mother who loved comic books, who loved science fiction, who loved horror, fantasy, all this kind of stuff, and we would watch these things together. And I think that I could probably draw before I could write, you know. And not to be all like Norman Rockwell on you, but I actually literally used to crawl on top of a barn, much to my mother's chagrin, and stare at the stars and wonder what was outside of this small little hamlet of a town in Mississippi that was out there, you know. And then when I discovered that there were stories connected to stars called constellations, constellations and stories that were connected to these particular stories, I was just blown away by that, you know. And so I read avidly. I started drawing really early, and I was doing like a lot of work as a kid, you know, making my own comics. And little did I know I was training myself to become a graphic designer or like a visual storyteller, you know. So anyways, here's just a body of my work that I just kind of did a picture of. So I wanted to talk about a lot about my work around representation first, because this is kind of what led me to this cultural space called Afrofuturism. These are from 2008. I was pondering the notion of Black identity and the stereotype. The stereotype comes from a printing term, right? It's a printing term. It was created in the 1800s by a gentleman who was French called Firmin Didot, from a very long line of French printers and paper makers. And it was a method of making one particular page over and over again using paper mache. It really doesn't get used the way we think about it, from this limiting kind of like essentialist notions of like identity until like 1920, 1922 by Walter Lippmann. And basically he was thinking about how we imprison people in stereotypes to a certain degree, and how we kind of judge people according to the stereotypes, and how those particular stereotypes become a representation of a whole body of people, right? So stereotypes comes from the word stereos, which is Greek for hard or fixed. Hard or fixed. So this notion of fixity is something that I'm really concerned with, right? So I was reading the Cyborg Manifesto by Donna Haraway, and I was considering the fact that it works really well as kind of a feminist manifesto from a white perspective, but it really doesn't deal with this notion of race, right? Because I'm like, well, maybe a white cyborg is free, but what if you're a black cyborg? You know, what systems are you dealing with as a black cyborg, right? And how do these particular types of images get replicated, right? How do you move from being cargo to slave to Negro to thug to angry black man? You know what I'm saying? It's the same notions. So you're just kind of updating the kind of nomenclature of the black body, right? The other thing they talk about is the idea that race is a designed object. It's a designed thing, right? It's constructed, right? And then we're taught to actually fit into those particular kind of categories, right? So I was like, well, if the metallic part of the cyborg is like the structured part, then the fleshy part is that part of us that's real. And a lot of times, just if you borrow from, say, Du Bois, we're talking about these two warring sides in one dark body fighting against each other. That's like a cyborg to me. And so I started making these images after a stint at James Madison University in their diversity, as a diversity scholar. And I was working on a show. I was curating a show in Kyoto at Doshisha University, and I was really influenced by like manga and like the the way that Japanese folk like deal with like these giant robots, and I was really, so I started thinking about this a lot. And I did this show, and I did research for like 4 months or so, and these are all digital. They look like they're woodcuts, but they're all digital. And what they were doing was kind of thinking about the commodification of blackness, the replication of blackness, the utility of blackness. And what I mean by utility is that, you know, if you think about it, when the cotton gin was created, it was really an upgrade, right? It was an upgrade from the fleshy machine of the slave's body that was really like an extension of the master's whim, right? So we're talking about fleshy machines and how these particular ideas kind of like meld into the science fiction kind of narrative, right? And when I started working on these, they kind of flowed out of me. There's about 74 of these. I did them in 4 days. I couldn't stop working on them. It's like I was possessed with these images. When they started, they just came and came and came until they were done with me, you know? And I showed them to my friend, Dana Rush, and she said, these look Afrofuturist. And I was like, stop making up words, what is that? That's not what is that? You know, and then once I started doing research on this particular area of study, I was like, maybe they are maybe they are Afrofuturists, you know? So what I did is I threw myself into like learning as much as I could about Black speculative culture. I was introduced to the wonderful Octavia Butler's work. The first thing I read of hers was Wild Seed, and then I read everything else. I was just hooked from then on. The wonderful Henry Dumas's work. I started looking at Amiri Baraka's work from a very speculative lens, right, from the Black Arts Movement. And I realized that we had been working on this type of this work, using speculation as a tool for engagement with social justice for a very long time, you know. So even though this term was coined in the early 90s, we had a history of doing this for a while, right? So I became utterly fascinated with it. And what started to happen was I started to make more of these images and think really a lot about how these particular notions of like the machine, of publication, of literacy were tools of engagement with these particular ideas, and also how they became what I call liberation technologies, right? So I was actually fortunate enough to actually do the cover for Ytasha Womack's book on Afrofuturism. And over the last, say, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, the way that I think about these particular images has kind of driven the aesthetic around this new resurgence of Afrofuturism that kind of started around like the election of Barack Obama, really, you know? And also the ubiquitous nature of how we make things now, and also the fact that you know, all these communities of nerds, like Black nerds, now had a space where they could congregate and actually make things, right? Because if you're a nerd in school and you're a Black nerd, right, you were isolated. I was isolated, right? You can't, you know, now no one's isolated. You have these different communities and things, right? And so now, like, being a nerd is like in, you know, because Barack Obama was a nerd. He was a massive comic book fan, that kind of thing. He loved Star Trek, that kind of thing, right? So they made it cool to think about these ideas around how powerful it is to be able to make these things. We have these beautiful maker spaces, right? And how technology has empowered us in such a way. And the printing on demand revolution actually happened too. That actually was a huge shot in the arm to the Black independent comics publishing arena, right? So here are just some of the things I've been working on over the last few years. I'm gonna speed through these. I'm gonna stop for a second and talk about this. Again, I'm from Mississippi, and I was thinking about the fact that when you think about the South, a lot of times you think about the past, right? You think about, I used to say that, you know, really, you know, America put its darkest thoughts in the closet of the South. Like it's where America buries its bones, you know what I'm saying? And a lot of people haven't been to Mississippi. They drive through Mississippi on their way to spring break in Miami, or they're on their way to New Orleans, right? You know, people are afraid of it. It has these kind of like dark imaginings around it. And I was like, you know what? Honestly, a lot of these people who are thinking about Afrofuturism are from the South. That includes people like David Banner, George Clinton, Sun Ra, Maurice White. And then once you start to actually push open what an Afrofuturist is, to me, like the first slave that said, you know what? I don't like slavery. I'm going to leave. And head with that North Star up north, dreaming of a better future. That's an Afrofuturist notion. We've always used storytelling to actually hack into these particular things. And I always say that whenever someone is in an oppressed system, the people who are in an oppressed system understand that system better than the people that created it. Because we're always looking for a nook, for a cranny, for a way out. Always looking for it. So if you're coming from that particular standpoint, you understand the system and you can hack into that system. I call it chitlin hacking. Chitlin hacking is using the thing that was supposed to kill you, supposed to destroy you, and flipping it on its ear and saying, you know what? I'm not going to take this. I'm going to take this. I'm going to survive. So what we did is we went down to Jackson, Mississippi, to my alma mater, Jackson State University, and we did this thing called Planet Deep South. And it was one of the most awesome experiences. Some people who had never been to Mississippi in their life, right, who went through Medgar Evers' house, who walked down the street the king walked down, and actually understood that this is where aspiration starts, is this idea of fighting against this particular oppression. So, how many people been to King's Mountaintop? Have you been there yet? To Dr. King's Mountaintop that he talks about? Have you been there? You're trying to get there, right? So if you have your waves out, or if you got your GPS, maybe you could tell me where that mountaintop is, because I haven't seen it yet. And what I mean by that is an imaginary space. He was imagining himself in the future, said he wasn't gonna get there, knew he wasn't gonna get there, and actually was creating this particular space for us to be in, right? That we're still aspiring to. That's a black speculative, political notion right there, Anyway, these are some of the things I've made. I'm not gonna talk about these. I'll go through them really quickly. So what is Afrofuturism, right? And then, how does it relate to comics? All right, so this is actually from Ytasha Womack's book. It's more of a more modern description of it. So Afrofuturism is a cultural aesthetic, philosophy of science, and philosophy of history that combines elements of science fiction, historical fiction, fantasy, Afrocentrism, and magical realism with non-Western cosmologies in order to critique not only the present-day dilemmas of black people, but also to revise, interrogate, and re-examine the historical events of the past. So if you look at alternative histories, a lot of Maddies Rocket's work, I think, was extremely, surrealist and Afrocentric. Toni Morrison's work, Henry Dumas's work, where they're actually utilizing an imagination as kind of a technology or a tool to get at the questions that are being imposed and projected upon the black body on a day-to-day basis, right? Now, as far as how this relates to comics, when let me see here. When Mark Derry kind of posited what Afrofuturism was, he was actually thinking about how black people in America were utilizing this thing called the World Wide Web. I don't know if y'all are familiar with it, or the hyperglobal meganet. How he was actually using, how we were using this as a people in the early 90s to deal with being in this kind of uncanny existence. How does someone, stop being technology and use technology in this new way, right? So he was kind of positing this. And so he was looking at things like Samuel R. Delaney's work. He was looking at, he was talking to people like Trisha Rose. He was talking to people like Greg Tate. He was looking at people like Nalo Hopkinson, Stephen Barnes, Tananarive Due. So all these different speculative writers that were actually utilizing this technology. The other thing he was looking at was comic books, right? And I always found it really, really interesting that when we talk about Afrofuturism, which was posited in 1993, this is an actual scan from Black to the Future by Mark Derry, which was in his collection Flame Wars, which came out in 1993. These are comics from Milestone Media, which is a black-owned company that was distributed by DC Comics, right, in the early 90s. Anybody familiar with Static Shock? Show of hands. All right, so Static Shock was a character that was part of this Milestone universe, and so now we're talking about diversity in comics left and right. They were concerned with diversity comics for everyone, even though they were a black-owned company. They were already concerned with people who were LGBTQ, right? They were concerned with people who were poor. They were concerned with people who were white, Cuban, whatever. They were already doing the work, right? And these were good books. And when I was in the 90s, I was kind of disenchanted with all the different crossovers and all the stuff the X-Men was doing. This excited me, and I wanted to be down with them, right? So Mark Derry is actually juxtaposing black comics already with this idea of Afrofuturism. So for some reason, though, we've kind of lost sight of that. So for instance, this image right here, this is by Dennis Cowan, one of my heroes, actually. And he's a co-founder of Milestone. I said, Dennis, did you know that you're juxtaposed with this idea of Afrofuturism? He's like, no, I never heard of that. I have no idea. And this is a disconnect between the scholarly side of this production and also the cultural production side of these things. How do we get these people to talk to each other? Now he's down, he's like, I understand like how this is important and how I was doing this kind of work. But people were actually talking about him, Michael Davis, Dwayne McDuffie, and Derek Dingle, the founders of Milestone, in this way. Now what's really interesting though, was that Mark Derry, this is him right here, in his definition, he basically talks about speculative fiction that treats African-American themes and addresses African-American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture and more generally African-American signification, appropriating the images of technically and prosthetically enhanced futures, right? That's kind of like the cyborg piece, might, for want of a better term, be called Afrofuturism. The notion of Afrofuturism gives rise to a troubling antimony. Can a community whose past that has been deliberately rubbed out and whose energies have subsequently been consumed by the search for legible traces of its history imagine possible futures? That's a very powerful question. So I want to look at something right quick. He was basically talking about Western, like people who were descended from slaves who live in African American, who live in our country, right? He really wasn't dealing with the diaspora that much, right? There's been a rise of a term called African futurism because there's so much speculative fiction coming out of the continent. There's so much speculative fiction coming out of like Barbados and Jamaica and all these different like African diaspora countries because we have the access to printing on demand technology, the World Wide Web, all these different ways of making that are coming out of that experience. And I don't think he was ready to deal with that yet, and I really appreciate the fact that he was seeing this kind of like mapping of cultural production and then talking about it, right? The other thing I want to talk about is the fact that he talks about technology. Now, technology is not just my cell phone. Technology is also the systems that make it. Technology is pretty much anything that are extensions of ourselves. So if you look at like Beth Coleman's work, who used to teach at MIT, she talks about race as a technology, right? Because when you erase the silly notion that there's anything to do with difference around race, and you think about it as a expression or like as a matrix, it becomes a technology. So that's what started me thinking, like, man, you know what? Then what can't be a technology, right? So I was watching this movie by John Jennings, who was a black gentleman from the UK, and he did this documentary called The Last Angel of History. It's 1997. Around the same time this stuff was being talked about, right? He was analyzing black speculative culture and music, like digital music. So a boy named Gerald, Parliament Funkadelic, he was looking at the underground resistance that was coming out of Detroit and looking at how this particular musical way, that this was a way of telling stories through music, right? And he talks about the Robert Johnson mythology. You guys familiar with Robert Johnson? Went down to the crossroads, sold his soul to the devil, and became a virtuoso blues player. And he said in the opening of this movie that the blues was a black secret technology. And I was like, what? I was like, are you kidding me? It inspired me. I did an entire blues series, it was called Thief at the Crossroads, and I was looking at blues as a technology. And if you combine that idea with Amiri Baraka's piece, Rhythm Travel, how many people read Rhythm Travel? Show of hands. Okay, Rhythm Travel is a very short piece about by Amiri Baraka, where he has a friend that is an inventor that creates a time travel device that allows you to time travel through music. So, but for instance, whenever, like, say, one of James Brown's top pieces was created, like Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, you could time travel from when it was created to whenever in the future it would be created or would be heard, right? That is mind-blowing. I was like, this is so wonderful to me. So the last thing that was interesting too was the fact that Brother Derry gave us some wiggle room. And I like wiggle room, right? Every artist likes wiggle room for lack or for want of a better term. For want of a better term, right? All I need is a little bit of space, and he gave us that space. And he was like, I think this is what I'm gonna call it right now. So for want of a better term. So since then, when we have this, what my friend Ronaldo Anderson calls Afrofuturism 2.0, we've actually updated to this new version, right? Then now we're looking at these other spaces, astral blackness, what I call the ethnogothic, right? Like if you're doing Afrofuturism, do you pay attention to genre? I don't know. These are questions that we have a lot of questions, right? But now we have the time and the energy to answer these things, right? Anyway, sorry, I went off on a tangent. So these are some of the Milestone characters, right? So while Milestone is jumping off, there is an underground comics culture that was actually jumping off around the same time in the early 90s that was under the radar, right? Under the radar. The other thing I wanted to talk about too for just a second was this character Deathlock, right? So, and this is something that maybe I'll talk to Derry about, Mark about in the future, was he was talking about Milestone Media in 1993 around these characters. This particular character, Deathlock, who is a black programmer who is a pacifist, right? His body is turned into a war machine, right? So he's a cyborg. His consciousness is in cyberspace, right? But he also has his body, and his brain has been taken out of his body. So he has triple consciousness, like Fanonian triple consciousness jumping off. And the name of this book is called The Souls of Cyberfolk, right? This is 1991. So we're already thinking about using this stuff, you know, the science fiction and fantasy to deal with these particular issues, right? And I always wondered why he didn't include it. That's all I wanted to say. I remember asking him. Maybe he didn't know about it, but I'm like, this predates his positing of Afrofuturism. And this is a comic book. You can pick this up on Comixology or just pick up a copy of it. So the thing that I think about a lot is Afrofuturism really is looking forward and backward simultaneously. Very much like Papa Legba would or Janus would, right? Where it's about simultaneity, you know? It's about co-presence. The ancestor is right here, right? You ever seen Daughters of the Dust, right? Where the spirit of an unborn child is haunting the present. What? That is crazy. So this idea of like cyclical time, it's a very different way of looking at time. You know, it's a non-Western cosmology around how we look at time, right? So this is what I did to kind of symbolize that. So I want to talk really quickly about some of the great folk who actually have were forefathers or people who have been working in this work around Black independent comics for a while. This is Tertil On Lee. Tertil On Lee coined the phrase the Black Age of comics. And I laughingly call him the Master P of comics. Because essentially he was buying black comic books, right? And then distributing them by putting in spin racks in different places. He was a one-man distribution like army, right? He's out of Chicago, he's an artist. And he was thinking about the fact that, anybody collect comics? Anybody collect them? So when I say like the golden age of comics, the silver age of comics, you know what I mean? So you have these different ages of comics, right? According to, you know, when they were produced, right? So he was like, well, what about the black age of comics, right? I was like, that's a good question. so because of that question, he created the original black comic book festival that jumped off at Kenwood Academy for many years and inspired a lot of us to create these independent, ethnocentric conventions all over the country, right? So after that, and we'll talk about that one in a second, the East Coast Black Age of Comics, where me and Jerry Craft met, Onix Khan, all these different conventions, right, were spurring to us, or spun off of this particular gentleman's idea around the Black Age of comics. And this is like early 90s, right, Jerry? Is it? Yeah, see? Jerry's like, mm-hmm. Or should I say amen? The other person I want to talk about really quickly is a master illustrator, Mr. Mashindo Kumba I, right? This gentleman is really criminally unsung. And this is something I want to kind of talk about because we're looking at these mainstream comics like Milestone Media, but Mashindo's been making comic books and making illustrations like this. This is digital, by the way. This is actually Photoshop. This is digital. Masterfully so, imagining us in these really, really wonderful spaces. And if you haven't seen his work, you have to check it out. But he's one of the original Afrofuturist underground comics artists, you know, right? And he was making this work, and he still makes this beautiful work, you know, for us to enjoy and empower us, right? And I think that, and this is something I was talking to Wendy about the other day too, because we had this meeting. She was talking about the fact that comics and like speculative fiction are already kind of denigrated a little bit. They had to become literature, you know? And so imagine all the different things that we're kind of fighting against, right? So you're looking at like science fiction, and then you're black, and then you're independent too. And you know, this is work that's being created with no distribution at all, right? and only being sold at these African art fairs and things of that nature. That's our distribution center, right? The work is beautiful. And again, I want you to check his work out. He's a masterful, this is a picture of him here, but just a really, really brilliant man, and also like a masterful artist, you know. And he has been making this work out there for us for, what, 20 years, 30 years? So, another person I want to talk to right now is the amazing Tim Fielder. Tim Fielder's from Mississippi. We went to the same school. We went to Jackson State University. He's a twin who also went to Jackson State University. His brother is Arthur Jaffa, the cinematographer. He was the cinematographer for Daughters of the Dust, right? But Tim was making this work, you know, kind of in a vacuum, you know? And again, he wasn't being looked at because, you know, big companies like Marvel and DC, they take up all the air in the room, you know? We'll pick someone and actually put that forward, but we won't want to look at these independent, like really, really wonderful artists out there. So Tim created this book called Maddies Rocket. It's an alternative history piece set in like the 1930s about a black woman from Mississippi who becomes an astronaut and fights against interstellar like Klansmen and aliens and stuff. This is crazy. And you can get this now, you know, you can get this now. I know he was like, yes. Anyway, yeah, it's amazing. And he's just a ball of energy, right? This is some of his pencil work, right? And this is kind of like what I'm doing. We'll do like a show and tell, just to introduce you to some of these amazing people that have been doing this work right under your noses, you know? Now, I'm not making fun of you or anything. I'm just saying it's just that it's amazing that this is out there, right? And so he uses a hybrid form with like 3D animation, but also kind of like, you know, hand-done work as well. He's going to allow me to show one image of this. This is going to be his masterpiece. It's called Infinitum. It's called Infinitum. It's amazing. So it's about an African king who is cursed by his concubine, right? It's an ancient African king. His queen is barren and can't have an heir, and so he steals the child from his concubine. She curses him to live forever. So he becomes John Henry. He becomes Stagger Lee. He becomes, you know, John the Conqueror. It's mind-blowing, and he's been showing me work from it, and I'm like, this is a masterful piece. And this gentleman, man, I think is an unsung hero of Afrofuturism, and you definitely need to check his work out. And Maddies Rocket is out already, but this is gonna be amazing. I also want to talk about Roosevelt, Pitt, and Aniyah comics. At the same time, we're doing this work and putting out this work, high quality work, at the same time that Milestone is existing, at the same time all these other characters like John Stewart and Black Lightning and Luke Cage are existing. We're doing this work, but invisible, right? Under the radar, you know, making, you know, hustling and actually utilizing the comics, again, as a liberation technology and actually empowering ourselves economically and spiritually and culturally, right? The Love Brothers. I remember the first time I saw the Love Brothers, Ghetto Set Comics, right? They were talking about nanotechnology when I didn't even know that was. They're out of California, live in Sacramento, right? Very, very talented. All of them are talented. All of them are artists. It's Maurice, Robert, and Jeremy, right? Even the older brother, who's now an actor, was an artist, an animator. And when I saw Chocolate Thunder, which is kind of like a send-up of like the blaxploitation era, I thought it was really amazing. And then Nano Man was using like nanotechnology to talk about these things. Currently, Robert Love is best known for Number 13, and also his brother Jeremy. He did this really amazing book called Bayou. And Bayou's like Song of the South meets like Alice in Wonderland meets like Swamp Thing. It's brilliant. It's a brilliant book. His current book is called Black Lotus. It's almost like Blackula set in like England during the turn of the century. It's gonna be called Black Lotus. Alex Simmons. How many people are fans of, say, like Doc Savage or like Indiana Jones, right? So what if Indiana Jones was African American? He'd be Blackjack. He's been making Blackjack since the early 90s and is a pioneer, really wonderful artist and writer and voice actor. Has written Sherlock Holmes, Tarzan for Archie Comics, but his heart is Blackjack. So check out Blackjack when you get a chance. Tim Fielder did that one. That's pretty awesome. Mr. Jerry Kraft, who's right there. Jerry, who co-founded the Schomburg Center, the Schomburg Center's Black Comix Festival with me, is a longtime advocate and cultural activist around this work. Does really, really wonderful workshops. He's been doing a workshop tomorrow with us, and has always been a stalwart supporter of this work. You know, so I really want to thank you for that, for doing this work. Created an amazing strip called Mama's Boys. Is actually getting ready to release a new piece. This is semi-autobiographical, right? Called New Kid from HarperCollins, which is dropping in February. But Jerry is so prolific and so talented and so smart and funny and makes some of the most amazing work. And this is a poster for the festival that we painstakingly put together for like the last 6 years. You know? So imagine like, was it like 12,000 kids now maybe? 12,000 children, families coming through the Schomburg, one of the blickety blackest spaces on the planet Earth, looking for Black independent comics. The reason why we do this work is because all of those kids, when I think Deirdre said we've actually serviced maybe like 40 or 45,000 kids, right? Imagine being a Black kid and not ever knowing what it means to not be subject, to not be the center of the story. That's powerful, right? I can't talk about this without talking about Brother Man, the Sims family, Guy Sims, Dawood Relay. Brother Man, without distribution in the early 90s, sold close to 1 million copies of these books by hand. Brother Man, Dictator of Discipline, basically showed us the way to actually make this particular situation work. 750,000 or so comics sold by hand. That's liberation, right? That's the liberation technology. How many people have seen this stuff before? Brand new stuff. Okay, so comic nerds. Anyway, he's like, well, anyway, I know, right? Now, Dawood also is an animator. If you've ever seen Ed, and Eddie, or if you've ever seen the Wild Thornberries, then you've seen Dawood's work. He's an Emmy Award-winning illustrator and animator. Right now, he's working with Kwame Alexander on his book Crossover. Right? Really wonderful work. Check it out. Also, I want to throw in something. You guys ever seen Mantis? So Mantis was a television show about a scientist who was injured and becomes a paraplegic and actually creates a suit of armor and actually fights crime. This came out again in the early 90s, right? This is like the mid 90s. So again, we're talking about this, this Blackness and technology being fused together. Right? He's a cyborg, essentially, right? For the last 16 years, the East Coast Black Age of Comics Convention, I think, is the oldest one of these particular ethnocentric conventions, and has spawned numerous ones, right? So every May, this is where the Glyph Awards is given. The Glyph Awards are given out for excellence around Black images in comics every year in May in Philadelphia, right? And the East Coast Black Age of Comics is a space of celebration and liberation, and talks about this, co-founded by Yumi Odom, right? Well, it's Joseph Will III just celebrated his 10th anniversary of Onix Khan. This is out of Atlanta. It's at the Southwest Arts Center every year. Onix Khan celebrates, again, these particular notions of like liberation and science fiction and fantasy, and it's a southern space that's been around for a decade. Have you ever heard of Onix Khan? All right, so I'm glad I did this because we also have places like Mecca Con, founded by Maya Crown Williams, and also Motor City Black Age of Comics, founded by Andre Batts, thank you. I've been doing this work as well, and let's see what else we got here. How many people are a fan of Tom Feelings? All right, yes, yeah, exactly. Did you know that he did a comic strip called Tommy Traveler that was about a kid who was reading African American history and time traveling in it? Right, this is 1991. This is 1991, we see all this stuff is happening in the 90s, right? So I think it's really interesting that this particular term gets introduced and then people start making this work, right? I think I'm doing okay. More recently, the Power Knights from Kid Comics. This is Keithan Jones. This is what Keithan does. He makes comic books. That is his main job. He puts out comic books. This brother, whenever I talk to him, he's listening to hip hop and making comic books. That's what he's doing. And this is his primary job. So we have people like our friend Chuck Collins, who bounces at night. He's a bouncer, and he'll go home and he'll make a comic book. And he makes a comic about being a bouncer, actually, too. So we're talking about people who are baristas, right? Talking about people, professors like myself, or people who are working in construction, who love the medium of comics so much that they, after a long day of work, and make no mistake about it, comics are very difficult to make. They're very hard to make. And then they go home and they make comics because they love it so much, right? And this is what Keithan does. And he's also started his own Black comic book festival called Black Comix Day. That's going to be, he's going to do his second one in February. So this is in San Diego. I have to talk about Greg Anderson Elise. This is our SpiderMan. He created our SpiderMan. So he used Anansi the spider mythology to create Isnana the were-spider. And he's in his second volume now. So what I'm talking about is utilizing our cultural artifacts to make these particular stories, to teach our kids about where they come from, to empower them through this particular type of work. So, C. Spike Trotman. Show of hands, C. Spike Trotman. Okay, all the Black comics nerds. I love the fact you haven't heard of her, because let me tell you, C. Spike Trotman has created a publishing kind of empire, Iron Circus Comics, based off of Kickstarters. She publishes out of Chicago. Her company is called Iron Circus, and she is one of the biggest comics publishers in Chicago. C. Spike Trotman, right? From what I understand, her husband used to be in banking or something like that, and he stopped being a banker to help her with her job, because she was making more money. So this is a viable space, and she's actually utilizing the internet, and she's a master of doing this type of work. So check her out, right? So this notion of utilizing the past to make something about the future, you gotta look at Greg Burnham and Marcus Williams' work, Tuskegee Air. So imagine like Robotech, or like a giant robot story mixed with like the Tuskegee Airmen, and fuse it together. They're out of Atlanta, and they're making this work. It's beautiful work, you know. Regine Sawyer, who also is a comic book writer, created the Women in Comics symposium, which travels around to different spaces. And this is open to all women who are in comics, primarily women of color, but this is something that she started, Women in Comics, called WINK, right? And what I love about this is the grassroots nature of this. Like, this is under the radar. This is people that are doing this work, and we've always been doing this, right? I guess you're getting my point about that, right? Deirdre Holman, who is our co-founder of the Schomburg Centerpiece, has started her own Black Comics Collective and is now doing programming for New York Comic Con and other spaces, right? This will be her second Black Comics Expo coming up in February. This is in New York at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Okay, because of technology, a lot of these comics have been being distributed online. Talk about utilizing the technology. A lot of comics that I read now are on what they call Comixology. It's an app for reading comics. This is sort of the Black version of that. There's this brother named Imani Latif, who lives in Ohio, created Peep Game Comics, and it's primarily downloadable Black content online. Peep Game Comics out of Ohio. So I've been doing, like I said, I've been doing this work for a while with my friend Damian Duffy and collecting this work. And once I saw that there was this vibrant community about it, the scholar in me wanted to collect it together and archive it, right? So the first Black Comics book came out in 2010. It's out of print. Unfortunately, Mark Batty Publisher went out of print. The first book is very difficult to get, but I'm definitely gonna get y'all a copy, Lamarchi, for your holdings, okay? But it's hard to get. We were approached by Lion Forge, Magnetic Press Lion Forge, to do a second collection of this, and it's available now. It's a coffee table book, and in the first book is 56 creators of color, who are all publishers, by the way, all using publishing in that way to kind of hack into that particular system. This has over 100. It also has all of the different cons that I just talked about in the back as a research guide, and also written essays by people who are actually studying the culture. It's out right now. It's super affordable. I'm very proud of it. The cover is by Ashley Woods, who's a self-taught comic book artist, who's one of the top comic book artists working right now, right? Also, I want to talk about David Stewart II, who is a gentleman who owns Lion Forge Comics. This is probably the most, this is the largest black-owned comic book company in the country right now, Lion Forge. They're doing a lot of amazing things. They have multiple lines. They're doing gaming. They're doing comics for kids. They're doing storybooks. They're actually adapting works from people in Europe and redistributing them. And they're out of St. Louis. They're called Lion Forge. This is our publisher for the Black Comix Returns book. And this is happening right now, okay? And this is some of the work that they've done. Catalyst Prime is basically a collection of comic books that are superheroes that are very, very, you know, for 5 minutes, really? Oh man, I didn't mean to be calling you out like that. 5 minutes, okay, some of my other work. It's a lot of stuff to show. I definitely want to talk about Sankofa right quick. So what I did was I came up with this notion of going back and getting it. The idea of the Sankofa bird or the Sankofa symbol. Going back, pulling it to the front, right? So a lot of the work that I've been doing is around that idea. Back in 1947, All Negro Comics was created by Oran Evans. One issue was put out. It's a collection of comics from different genres. And basically what happened was him and his partners laid out the second issue. This did really well, but because of discrimination and racism, they were not allowed to produce more books. They weren't sold materials for this thing, and it was squashed. So a lot of the ideas that we're talking about here, as far as like alternative comics that could have happened from this, were diminished by this particular aspect of racism, right? So this is something that happened in 1947, and this particular comic book company, it just didn't go further. Now, Oran Evans actually ended up becoming like an amazing newsman. He was a newsman that worked for a newspaper out of Philadelphia. He actually became like the celebrated author. But All Negro Comics now is basically public domain. So these particular characters, you can actually make characters from them, right? So Lion Man, for instance, who was a gentleman who was from like the United Nations, was sent to protect this magical mountain of uranium in Africa. His name's Lion Man. Yes. Sugarfoot, which is kind of a romantic comedy piece, he's a musician. Ace Harlem, who's a detective. So what I've started doing is actually going back and getting it and updating these comics. So I've designed like versions of Lion Man for every decade. I'm working on this right now. I went and found a lion-headed god called Mantis and actually did a version of him as a mystical lion man. Here's some of the updates that actually kind of critique some of the aspects of Black Panther that I didn't kind of dig as well. So just a little bit. Also, what if Ace Harlem was a superhero? So I actually started positing these particular ideas. What if Sugarfoot was kind of this mystical notion? This is all my work based off of the original All Negro Comics. Ever heard of Butterfly? Created in 1971. She's public domain, the first African-American female superhero. This predates Storm and the Bumblebee. What happened was this company, Skyward Publishing, put out these two issues of her. She was a crime fighter. She was a lounge singer who would go out and fight crime later and racism later. He didn't do his copyright designations correct. So what happened was when these two magazines came out, they were instantly in the public domain. This character's public domain. So what I did again, updated her. Let's work with her. Why is no one working with these characters? So I made her into like a street vigilante character. But also, what if she actually becomes a butterfly? She becomes a mystical protector, you know, against evil, right? Dealing with the way that the desire, but also the disruption of the Black female body happens, right? Last thing I want to talk about really quickly. Lorene Williamson and Pamela Thomas created this thing called the Museum of Uncut Funk, right? In 1950, the Pittsburgh Courier had these 4 characters that were created by white creators that were genre characters: a cowboy character, a spy character, a flatfoot detective character, and a spaceman, a black Flash Gordon character called Neil Knight. And when I saw this, I contacted them and I said, please, can I work with you on this? So I partnered with them. And here's some of the Neil Knight books. And this was a strip that was in a black newspaper in 1950s. So he has to be like the first like Afrofuturist like character. So this is my updates of the character. So we're working on doing books with this particular character now. Mark Hunt, which was like the private eye character. I'm updating and putting him in like a science fiction space. Eben, this is the last thing for real, because I gotta go. Eben was created by this gentleman named Larry Fuller, who's still with us. He is in his mid-70s. So anyone familiar with the underground comics movement from the 1960s and like the Haight-Ashbury? Right. Right. A lot of these particular characters were created by white creators. So he was one of about 3 African-American creators. It was him, Ray Thorne, and Grass Green. Unfortunately, Thorne and Green have passed on, but Larry Fuller created this kind of Afrofuturist Superman character that was called Eben, and it's only 1 issue of this. So I reached out to him and I was like, can I please update this character? So we've been working together to update this character. So through this idea of like speculative Sankofa, I'm actively trying to do this through like critical making, to bring these characters that are part of our history that have been hidden by time, you know, and updating these particular characters, right? So I think that this is the beginning of it. The last thing I want to talk about really quickly. Today, an announcement went out from my publisher of Kindred that this proposal that I put forth for an imprint was announced today. It's called Megascope. Megascope is going to be a collection of graphic novels for, by, and about people of color that use speculative ideas for social justice issues. So we're going to be reprinting and collecting work from the past, so work by people like Samuel Delany, Nalo Hopkinson. And I get the name from another science fiction story that was written by W.B. Du Bois called The Princess Steel, that was discovered by Britt Russert and, oh my God, Brown. I'm forgetting her name. I'm sorry. You can tell y'all taping this right now. But 2 sisters who found this piece, right? Had like Anyway, in this particular story, he uses this thing called the Megascope as a framing device to look through time and space. So I thought it would be a great name for an imprint. So I'll be consulting editor for a new line of these graphic novels that are going to be distributed like internationally. So again, using the idea of Sankofa to bring these ideas back forward and actually kind of re-empower us through this speculative notion. And that's why I'm gonna stop talking. Thank you. Yeah.